Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Jekyll. So this was my first introduction to James Nesbitt. Really, a lot of people would think that, oh, well, the very first thing that you ever saw was probably Stan Lee's Lucky Man. That was the first time you ever saw James Nesbitt, which isn't true. I actually saw him well before any of that with a little show called Jekyll. It's a 6 episode series that honestly you can actually just see on YouTube. Evidently, someone had put up every single episode on YouTube, so you can just go on to YouTube and just watch this entire series and then just see if you like it or not. Really, I love the fact that we end up having this character's origin, of course, being similar to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but it's slightly different because in the original Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, we end up having that character who ends up taking potions to be able to change from person to person, whereas in this iteration, we end up having Dr. Tom Jackman, who is to just change from himself to another person who doesn't really seem to have a name. It seems that we end up having this character needing to try and find a name somewhere. And I guess within this episode, he ends up just kind of taking names here and there, like Billy or Mr. Hyde or any number of things. We end up having Tom, who feels like a very much innocent character that is to try to be this nice and polite person, whereas we see in the opposite, we end up having Mr. Hyde, who becomes this very intimidating in your face character, where we end up having Hyde, who is otherwise almost also, if he is very angry, upset, and whatever, he's also very childlike and has a childlike wonder to him, which I find fairly fascinating. We end up having it to where Hyde in this scenario listens to the Lion King soundtrack and all kinds of other Disney tunes because it seems like that's the music that he gets into. That's what gets him into his mood, his environment, his whatever. Like I remember the wrestler who was Mick Foley that actually who played characters like Mankind and Dude Love and whatever. I remember him playing like Mary Poppins music before he would go out and wrestle somebody, just because like that's what got him in the mood. Really, when going into this show, if anything, if the very first episode doesn't sell you, eventually it very much is a really great episode once we get further along. We really have it to where at some points this show kind of breaks down as kind of like a horror style like show. We don't actually have seemingly like a real true monster character coming into the fray, but we end up having Hyde's character who is intimidating enough to basically give us that horror element. We really have it to where I think that this show is a lot of fun. And if you've never heard of this show, definitely, especially you can easily watch the entire series on Hulu right now, or YouTube right now. Not Hulu, YouTube. YouTube. Check it out on YouTube. I missaid that. I misread that. You could also reasonably also go and buy the entire season, which is actually fairly cheap on Amazon right now. You can watch the entire season via that, and you can watch it in high def and whatever the heck that you want. Also, you can go and just buy the entire season of which that I had done, and that's how I originally watched this show because I'm like, there's something about this show that looks really interesting. And so I ended up just buying it because I saw like a trailer like X amount of time ago. And then so I bought the show and I'm like, oh my god, this show is actually amazing. Like this show is so much fun. If anything, I can't wait for the episode for James Nesbitt, and I know it's a stupid thing. I just remember him talking about patio And like immediately every single time I'm looking at a patio section or something wherever I am, like I can just remember just really Tom Jackman who says patio. Like it's just a little stupid little thing, and I get it's like making fun of somebody's accent, but um, I don't know. That always like stayed with me of like patio, how he pronounced that. But anyways, going on into this show, we almost also have this like Hulk like story going on when we have really Dr. Tom Jackson who is forcibly ending up strapping Hyde into this electric chair, not to get electrocuted, just to be held down. We end up having also Tom who is to eventually try to research his ailment more. We end up having him trying to do research, and it seems that eventually we end up also having some private investigators that are also to be able to do some investigating as well. To where Tom is to eventually realize that really this is more than just schizophrenia, to where even like his body starts to shift and change when he is to be either one of these characters. It seems that Tom eventually goes on to eventually have seemingly Hyde tell him when he's coming, when he's turning, and it seems like they have basically broke it down into a science to where it seems that Hyde gets a certain window of time in the day, and we end up having Tom getting the rest of the day to be able to do his job or to be able to stay at home and so on and so forth. So, yeah, we end up also having a therapist of sorts, which is Catherine, who is to basically watch over Tom when he is to uh, eventually turn into Hyde. And so like she is kind of taking notes or being his assistant to help um, kind of go through these changes between these two characters. And we end up having Tom, who is really heavily recording everything, even to the point of having these two being able to talk to one another via a recorder, which I found to be just fascinating. I'm like, wow, that's actually really cool way for both of these characters um, to get to talk to one another without them actually being in the room. Or like we end up having it to where in some other scenarios, some other characters who would be uh, having to talk to themselves, they would like do cameras or videos or whatever. To where reasonably I would think in much more modern times, like it would just be this like quick video that the other person would send the other person to just let them know what's going on, and so on and so forth. So, with that said, yeah, really, I had to really just break down this first episode because really there's not a lot of stuff to break down in spoilers. It's kind of like the beginning of this show. And plus, I also kind of broke down most of this episode, anyways, even in the cryptic like sense, to get people prepared of what they're getting into. We really have it to where Hyde has kind of like a night on the town thing going on. And so uh, within this episode, we don't have him doing much of menacing stuff, but we do get to also see him in a quasi uh, certain role of which that Hyde has to do, which is also kind of really fun and almost Joker-esque. We end up having Hyde who has to forcibly play with his food, but he cannot eat it. So, like, he has fun with stuff. Like, it's really fun to see him for this brief moment. But eventually, once we see him a lot more down the road, we'll get to actually see him actually not only play with his food, but also eat it as well. So it'll be really fun to watch those moments. So, with that said, I think it's about time to go into that spoiler territory about the show because it's only the first episode and there's just 6 episodes, but every episode is like 50 some odd minutes, so it's just like, yeah, like I would love to just have watched this whole entire season in one sitting and just review it here, but I was like, yeah, that's gonna take 6 hours. Like it's better off to just like kind of like nip at these episodes here and there when eventually I have some spare time on my hands. So let's get into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm gonna do. Blah, 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 blah. It's about I messed up my spoiler time. Spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm gonna spoil this episode. So we have Tom Jackman, and I'm going to probably ill pronounce that. At some point, I'm probably going to say Jackson because I said that confusingly before. But, anyways, so we end up having Tom, who is to be a man who started to realize that he is to have shifted from being two different people. And so, the very beginning of this, we end up having it to where Tom is bringing in Catherine to let her know about this whole setup that it seems that um, Tom is to have. We end up finding out that Tom has not only surveillance on who would be Hyde in this episode, who technically in this episode he's going by the name Billy. And here's also the thing. We end up having Hyde who ends up calling Tom Daddy. Because, like, it's kind of a goofy thing to call him. Because we end up having Hyde who is kind of a very infant-like character. It seems like he ends up throwing tantrums and all kinds of things. But his, he is having, like, a childlike thing. But we end up having also this guy having a night on the town trying to sleep with women and all kinds of things as well. So we end up having Tom, who is to bring Catherine into the fold to let her know that not only Hyde is having surveillance being done on him, but so is Tom. Duo surveillance on both of them. So we end up having Catherine, who is to learn the combinations of not only Tom's chair, but also his safe. And so we end up having Tom, who is to eventually strap himself into this bizarre-ish looking chair because we are to have Tom switch into Hyde. So we end up having, of course, Tom recording to Hyde that that who this person is, that she can be trusted, and stuff along those lines. So we end up having, of course, Tom switching to Hyde because they have it under a strict time strain like thing, where Hyde can appear at 7 o'clock or certain kind of times of the day. But eventually it seems like these appearances of Hyde will become more frequently just because forcibly they have to, or forcibly, like, Hyde just wants to be active more. So we end up having it within this episode that we eventually have at some points Hyde going and sleeping with women, to where eventually when Tom is to wake up with having to pay a lady of the night twice, not realizing it, and eventually Catherine ends up mentioning that that Tom probably had to pay her twice, so like, hey, like, make sure that you only pay her once. So anyways, we have it to where Hyde doesn't even know that Tom actually has a family or anything. And so we end up having it to where every time that Tom switches to being Hyde, or Billy. I'm gonna call him Billy for the rest of this episode until like he changes his name. But Billy, we end up having him eventually going on to eventually discover that he is to have a family towards the tail end of this episode, but we'll get to that. So we end up having eventually Tom going home to eventually Claire, who Claire is to eventually tell Tom that she has been watching him, been paying a private eye to follow him because she wanted to know where he goes. And so we end up finding out that Tom is being watched over by a black van. And so we end up having Tom, who assumes that it is this private eye who is Miranda. So we end up having Tom, who is to eventually look at these photos that are taken and eventually figure out where the address of this private eye is. And so Tom ends up going out of his way to eventually finding this private eye. And so he ends up kind of asking her questions about what all that she has seen and everything like that. And Miranda ends up telling Tom that she's like, yeah, like, I've seen you and then I've seen your other you. And like, believe me, like, this is a freak show. Like, you guys are not one and the same. Like, there's something about your hairlines and all kinds of things that are very vastly different between one another. And I want to be able to discuss this further into another location, because we end up having Miranda, who ends up going and driving off to eventually have this black van driving off, and we end up having Tom, who is to basically follow after Miranda because she wasn't actually supposed to leave him. And so we have it to where Miranda is like, well, I had to because that black van is not actually mine. And so we end up finding out that Tom is being followed by someone. And so we eventually have to figure out who eventually that is. So we have it to where eventually Tom ends up going and seemingly trying to follow this character called Min, who is in a relationship with Miranda. And so we have it to where Tom is trying to follow Min, and Min is saying, like, yeah, you're not really too good at this. And so we end up having Min, who ends up following Tom to her home. And so Miranda ends up giving Tom the workup of mentioning that he seems to be a descendant from Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. To whereas before, the original guy would take these potions to be able to switch between two personalities, it seems like this swap is actually placed within this guy's genes to where he can just swap from time to time. And so eventually we end up having Miranda like mentioning how like much of a difference that these two characters would have, like hair on the arm and different hairlines and eye colors and stuff along those lines. And so while we end up having Jackman hearing all of this this interesting thing, we end up having it to where Jackman ends up switching from Jackman to Billy. And so Miranda ends up telling Min to go off somewhere, and so Miranda ends up trying to soften the blow of trying to win over Billy. And so Billy wants to know the exact address of his home, of his technically family. And we end up having Miranda noticing that Jackman has switched to Billy, because it's like, well, you know where your address is, you know where your home is. And he's like, well, what's my address? Like, I need to know. And so we end up having Billy within this episode find his address, find his home. Excuse me, I'm going to sit up here for a second. Whoa. We end up having... I'm going to pause here for a second. All right. We have Billy who ends up finding the home of not only his wife, but his 2 kids. And so we end up having it to where Billy is to eventually spend the day with his actual family. To where eventually we end up having Billy who ends up leaving a note for Tom to just say like, "Hey man," like a little video tape recording note. Just say like, "Well, hey, like I found my family," and because Tom actually finds his wedding ring, to where reasonably Hyde had left him, or Billy had left him a little note, like saying like, "This is my family, and you're my daddy," and and stuff like that. So we end up having Tom, who is threatening Billy, "This is not your family." And like I'm gonna get into more things with this episode. This is not towards the end because this is like the very end of this episode. But we end up having also Catherine, who is to eventually start to notice that it seems that Tom is getting quite a bit of research on his condition. And so we end up having it to where Catherine mentions to Tom that Billy should know that he has a family, but also Billy at the time didn't really have a name and he wanted that too. We end up having it to where Catherine is trying to convince Tom that that Billy should know he has a family, and Tom wants nothing of it. And we have it to where Catherine is also like, "Well, yeah, also, like Billy should also know that you're trying to come up with a cure." And here's the thing. So Tom mentions if Billy were to ever kill anyone, that Tom would actually just turn himself in. To where reasonably we end up having Billy, who is to eventually kind of have a night on the town where he ends up kind of bumping into 2 people who are doing it off to the side of the road. And we end up having this guy to otherwise be angry at Tom for bumping into them. And so we end up having Tom, who is realizing that slowly but surely he's going to turn into Billy soon. And so we end up having Tom, who is on the tape recorder, like, do minimal damage and, like, don't kill him because I'll find out. So we end up having Tom, who is kind of up against this wall. And so we end up having this guy who is upset with Tom, and so we end up saying that he's gonna like stab Tom, and so we end up having Billy appear, and he's like, "No, you're not." It's like, if anything, like I'm gonna give you 3 goes. Like, go ahead, try your best, stab me as much as you'd like. I'm just gonna stand here. Go ahead and do so. And so we end up having it to where this guy ends up like trying to stab Billy, but every single time we end up having Billy just seemingly appear from behind this guy, completely avoiding every single one of these stabs, to where we end up having Billy threaten this guy that after he has his 3 attempts of trying to kill Billy, he is going to break this guy's neck. And so we end up having it where Billy ends up getting seemingly all these 3 attempts and no stabbing. And so we end up having Billy, who ends up just crushing a rib or 2 of this guy and then walks away. We eventually have it to where Billy ends up trying to seduce a woman at some point into a bar, and we end up having him succeeding at this. But then eventually we end up having a guy coming in named Benjamin who ends up deciding to, like, hey, Mr. Hyde, like, I'm gonna basically, like, take control of you now. You're my detail, you're my property. And we end up having Mr. Hyde going, like, say, what now? Like, like, how is it that all of a sudden you have just control over me? Like, I don't think it works that way, buddy. And so we end up having Benjamin with some kind of thug with him. And so we end up having Billy, who ends up just easily, like, taking this thug and chucking this bigger thug than Billy just out this window like he's nothing. And we end up having Billy, or we end up having Benjamin. It's like, well, okay, I guess I'll come back for round two, kind of thing. So we eventually have Tom, who ends up going into this library to do some research. And so we end up having Tom, who I guess ends up bumping into his old superior, Peter Sim, and just kind of talking about old times. Uh, but yeah, like, I think that is like a bulk of what happens within this episode, for the most point. I think really we have. Uh, I'm trying to think of anything that I missed within this episode. Yeah, I think I kind of like grazed over everything and talked about everything. But yeah, I kind of left it at like a very odd moment within this movie because it's just like a transitional scene that doesn't, like, it doesn't matter anything in this episode, but it matters somewhere down the line later, um, of what Tom was trying to do. But anyways, yeah, like, we really have it to where we are not seeing the best of Billy yet, or Hyde yet. Eventually, he's going to become so much more scary, so much more intimidating, to the point of him scaring any number of people. And then we're also going to eventually see some flashbacks of Tom and Claire in their early stages of their relationship, and we're also going to eventually uh, we're eventually also going to see this build up between Benjamin's men and Tom slash Hyde himself. So yeah, with that said, because eventually we end up having kind of Hyde's character almost becoming this like Superman at some point, and that's kind of the interesting thing of this show. So, with that said, I am going to get out of here. Um, we eventually have at some point also that before I go, we end up having Tom, or we end up having Hyde, who end up scaring the daylights out of Miranda when she goes on to try to win over Billy. We end up having Billy, who ends up showing to her what he really looks like, to where we end up seeing this version of Billy where he has these like monsterish looking teeth to scare the crap out of this girl, because he had normal teeth before, but then it seems like there's a higher form of Billy that has these like monstrous looking teeth, and it kind of scares Miranda. But yeah, like, it would honestly be kind of interesting if they kind of went with and did this like another kind of Jekyll and Hyde kind of show right now. Um, but yeah, I think reasonably, I think they've tried things here and there, but nothing really and truly worked. Like, everything just turned into these mini series or one-off films that just didn't quite all work that well. So, with that said, I think I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.